The DIY Musician podcast has been going strong for 15 years, and this is our 300th episode. This episode is going to be a little different as we're going to celebrate. It's a celebration of the amazing independent artists that make up the now massive segment of the music industry. It's a celebration of all the people past and present here at CD Baby that work tirelessly behind the scenes to level the playing field for indie creators. And it's a celebration of perseverance because there were so many times where it would have been easier to let the podcast die, but here we are. We're going to talk origin stories, how things have changed, and how that change impacts where things are going. Even though this episode is a little different, I promise you will enjoy it. So let the celebration begin.
You're listening
to the CD Baby
CD Baby
CD Baby
DIY
Musician
Welcome to episode number 300 of the DIY Musician podcast. My name is Kevin Bruner. Joining me all the way going back to episode 1 is Chris Robley.
Hey there.
We made it.
We made it this far. 15 years, 300 episodes.
Crazy. I can't believe it. So today's episode, like I mentioned at the top, it's going to be a little different, but I guarantee you're going to enjoy the listen. You're going to have fun. You might laugh. You might shed a few tears. I was working on some of it last night and I got teary-eyed a few times, Chris.
I get teary-eyed at everything. I cry in every movie I ever see, so I'll probably cry too.
You already have some allergy stuff going on, so it already sounds like you're starting to get a little weepy, but
right.
You can just blame the allergies.
That's just nature.
Happens.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's going to be a great episode. We're going to start with laying the landscape of what the podcasting and the origin story of the podcast. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of CD Baby, because what's I think is really cool with 300 episodes going for 15 years, it's become this archive of the rise of CD Baby and the rise of the independent market and just how much has changed over that time. And then we're going to dive into 10 things that have changed over that time that are worth noting. And it's a good list. I know you're going to like it. But first,
10 things that have changed. It was a lot easier to do than 10 things we got completely wrong, because we've been right about absolutely everything in that 15-year time frame.
Of course. Now we'll talk about some of that too. But first, I want to remind everyone, whether you've been listening from the beginning or this is your first time listening to the podcast, to subscribe. We're on Apple Podcast and every podcast app. We're on Spotify, Amazon, and YouTube. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to hit the like button and that subscribe button. And on YouTube, you can leave comments below as well. And it would also be amazing if you would help us keeping the podcast going and thriving by sharing it with your other artist friends and let them know, hey, there's this great podcast you can check out that's amazing and helpful. That's just sharing is caring. So anyway, we would appreciate it. It helps us keep things going. And finally, before we dive in to celebrate our 300th episode, we have a special offer for all our podcast listeners. Right now, you can get 50% off your next single song release by using coupon code podcast300. Just head over to cdbaby.com, create your release, use podcast300 as the code, and you will save 50% on your single song release. And even if your song isn't ready, you can still get it into your account and take care of that submission fee. And so you save now and you can release later. And that is good until the end of May 2022, that is, because, 2 years from now, when someone's listening to this episode, they'll email and say, well, hey, the coupon code doesn't work.
They always do. I'm like, we recorded that episode in 2011.
I know. Come on. All right. Now that we got all the business out of the way, let's dive in. Chris, you wrote a little blurb about the state of podcasting as it was when we started this thing, because it's important context, because it was an interesting environment back then.
It was. Interesting is a good word for it. So you have to imagine a time when people would get together in a garage with really crappy microphones, and they would talk for 5 hours. They've had these long and winding conversations while simultaneously, like, smoking weed or drinking a bunch of beer, and 5 minutes into the conversation, they set your expectations. "We're gonna be talking about quantum physics and philosophy and all this stuff," but then what you hear for 5 hours is just this sprawling slur of inside jokes and yawning, and by the end, someone's passed out. That's one version of podcast. The other might be something like a journalist is sitting on the side of a noisy highway with a handheld recorder asking people on the street what they think of the George W. Bush administration. And then they take, these people's well thought out answers and chop them up into little 4-second snippets and put them together as a collage. It was a world where suddenly anyone in the world could become some combination of Terry Gross, Ira Glass, and Howard Stern. Only, of course, they would have like 1 trillionth of the audience that those people had. That was basically the state of podcasting in 2007, a year in which most people would say, "What's a podcast?" And then you'd say, "Well, it's kind of like a radio show that you listen to on an iPod, but it can be 15 seconds long or it could be 15 hours long." And they say, "Huh." So no one knew what they were doing. It was anything goes. And into this weirdness was born the DIY Musician Podcast.
Yeah, and I was a podcast junkie even before I started working at CD Baby. I just loved those conversations, like stuff that was not in the mainstream, conversations about topics like music and
Drunken astrophysics.
that wasn't really my thing, but yes, it was just this wild and crazy thing, low production quality and so forth. So that was the state of things when we started the podcast relating to podcasting. And I wrote up an origin story for the actual podcast, and I'm going to read it because I want it to be as succinct as possible, but still hit all the right notes. So here we go. This is our DIY Musician Podcast origin story. In 2007, I stayed late at CD Baby in order to ask Derek Sivers, CD Baby founder, for his blessing to start a podcast with CD Baby's name on it. He said, "Go for it." Honestly, I don't think he thought I would actually do it. I then enlisted the help of Chris Robley and Chris Bolton, who no longer works at CD Baby, whom at the time spent every day with me in a tiny room answering calls from artists who never imagined it was possible to distribute music without a label. Robley was the artist with the indie street cred in the Portland scene. Bolton was the fellow podcast junkie that really wanted to work at This American Life producing radio quality podcast shows. And I was the ex major label artist turned indie advocate that just wanted every artist to feel empowered to pursue a music career on their own terms. We had our first podcast planning session during our lunch break since it still wasn't official work business. The goal was to come up with at least 10 episode ideas before we started recording to ensure we didn't pod fade, the term used at the time to describe podcasts that die after a couple of episodes. Of course, none of us thought to bring a piece of paper to write this stuff down, and we predate the iPhone and smartphones. So we sketched out 10 episodes on a napkin at the Hot Lips Pizza on Killingworth Street in Portland, Oregon. And yes, it's a true napkin origin story. To me, that is the birthplace of the DIY Musician Podcast, that Hot Lips Pizza on Killingsworth. 15 years later and over 4 million downloads, the podcast is going stronger than ever. And if you go back and listen from the beginning, it's a fascinating historical archive of CD Baby and the rise of the independent artist community as it becomes a force to be reckoned with that the mainstream music industry can no longer ignore. So that's the blurb I wrote for our origin story.
I vaguely remembered that. If you'd have said, "Where did we start it?" I might have been able to tell you that pizza place. But what I remember even more than that is the conversation when you first said, "Hey, I'm thinking about starting a podcast." And I was one of those people that said, "What's a podcast?" And Chris Bolton, on the other hand, knew exactly. But it hit me as once you described what it was, I was like, that would be so great because you and I spent our days all day answering the questions of indie musicians as we were working in customer service at CD Baby early on. And I had gotten into this thing called cdbaby.org, which was a bit of a nightmare of a web forum where kind of you could write long form content to answer people's questions in advance. So I'd been doing a bit of that. Here's how you book a tour. Here's how you do whatever. And then you described what a podcast was. I was like, oh, this could just basically be long form customer service in advance before anyone even has to call us.
Yeah. Yeah, and that forum that you mentioned, it was just called cdbaby.org. It was just like this forum that was there. That's also where Derek Sivers at the time would put a lot of his thoughts, many of which he grouped together and made one of his books that he released many years later. So it was just kind of before social networks where artists could go and interact and ask questions of us or the community at large, share ideas. And yeah, for me, it was one of those things, we had been distributing to iTunes since 2004. I didn't start working at CD Baby till 2006. So between 2006 and 2007, when we started the podcast, it was like every day talking to an artist who's like, I need a label, and me spending a half hour on the phone with them saying, no, this is why you don't need a label. You have all the tools, go build an audience. And then the next call would be like an artist saying, yeah, I mean, you've seen YouTube. YouTube was still relatively young, and it was the wild west of video. Not a lot of content moderation back then. You never know what you might see on YouTube back then. But an artist would say, yeah, I'm using this thing called YouTube and I'm making videos and I'm building an audience and I don't even have to tour anymore. And I'd be like, wait a minute. All right, let me write this down. Tell me everything you know. And I want to hear everything about this. And so for me, it was like, I love podcasts and I want to be able to share all of these conversations or types of conversations with the artist community at large. Because if everybody I talk to throughout the day could hear what this person just said about YouTube, it'd be amazing. And if all the artists could hear that keep calling us, asking, telling us how they get a label deal, could hear the conversation I had with the artist telling them they don't, it would be amazing and save us a lot of work.
We had such an interesting vantage point too on the sort of I don't know, I'd say sort of modern rebirth of independent music because at the time in CD Baby customer service, not only were we servicing artists, but we were also taking orders over the phone for people who were purchasing music by independent
Yes.
artists. We were servicing the customers and the artists. And you'd notice after a while, oh, wow, this person who makes music exclusively about horses is selling thousands of CDs a week or a day. I don't remember. Or, this
It was
guy
a
who
lot.
only, yeah, this guy who only makes music about sailboats or this. It was just this like, super interesting look into niche artistry, sort of direct to fan sales. And we're like, oh, yeah, let's talk to these
Yeah,
people.
yeah, yeah. That I think that's an important piece of it. That, like you said, the unique advantage or vantage point we had was that we were talking to those fans, buying some very obscure music, and sometimes by the truckloads. And we would see those things moving serious units outside the mainstream that would never get talked about or even featured on any mainstream outlet or music industry outlet at that time. What are they doing? We want to know.
Yeah. Well, it was a wacky place. On the phone, it was
To
wacky.
say the least.
And the warehouse was wacky. The people were wacky. I feel like we should describe early CD Baby.
Someday we need to write a book. And people, I tell people all the time when I tell them about how CD Baby was back then, I'm like, I'm going to tell you a bunch of stuff. You're not going to believe any of it. You're going to think I made it all up or exaggerated greatly. And there is one, I would never be able to make most of this stuff up. Two, there is no need to exaggerate because the reality of what happened day in and day out was so far beyond what I would have exaggerated. It was every day was an adventure. I'd pull up to the building and be like, "What on earth is going to happen
What?
today?"
And it was not just that the things that happened were like extremely wacky. It was just at such a high velocity. Every
Yes.
day was something else crazy. And you'd be like, and I had just come from working at a bank. So going to work with a tie on every day. And then like I begged the vice president of CD Baby like every day for 3 years to get a job because I'd been selling my CDs with CD Baby. And finally he said, okay, come in for an interview. And I did. And my interview consisted of them giving me Derek Sivers' guitar and asking me to play Smoke on the Water. Like, can you play Smoke on the Water? And I was like, okay. Dun, dun, dun. And literally, I put the guitar down and they're like, you got the job. That was my interview, like playing a song. The girl who got hired after me came in with cupcakes. It was just, that's, that's normal compared to the stuff that would happen from that
Yeah.
point on.
Yeah, it was just a wacky place. It was just something uh, always happening, going down from artists accidentally sending us a box of their weed instead of their CDs to employees randomly disappearing for 2
For
weeks.
days, yeah, to
Yeah,
weeks, that's
no,
right.
nobody knowing where they went. They didn't
And
say anything.
where they had gone is they got on a train, and I don't mean inside the train. They were like old school 1930s hobo, got on the train and went to San Francisco and back without telling anyone, and, they kept their job. Everyone
They
always
just
kept
showed
their
up one
job.
day and they just showed up one day like nothing had happened. People
The
thought they were dead. I mean, we were concerned for this person, and then when they showed up, it was like, "Oh, okay, I guess they're back."
the people
Just
that worked in the warehouse, like, one of the guys had a van with, flat tires, so the van stayed constantly in the parking lot, and it was full of costumes, so you'd go into the warehouse to check out CDs, and one person would be dressed like the Incredible Hulk, and, like, they'd be, like, 7.5 feet tall.
at that time, there's a magazine called the Portland Monthly. It's a very nice magazine. Many cities have their own variation of this kind of thing, and they were gonna do a feature on CD Baby as one of the best places to work in Portland, and the management at the time specifically tried to keep that uh, that information quiet because the Portland Monthly was coming out to take photos and stuff of the workplace, but it got leaked, and so one of the warehouse guys that owned all those costumes went and got them all, and everyone in the warehouse was wearing a costume. And the feature in the Portland Monthly showed someone pulling CDs to ship wearing a giant pink bunny suit, and
S
that's what
I
that was our daily life at
well,
CD Baby.
I also feel like we should say for anyone who's like, "That's it?" No, we're just telling you the G-rated stuff, but it went all the way from G to X, but we're keeping this podcast
Yeah,
family friendly here.
there's a lot of things that it was a wacky place.
Oh,
Yeah, there's a
you should
lot. If you got Chris and I, if you bought us a drink one evening, we'd tell you stories. Again, you wouldn't believe us, but you'd be highly entertained, but it's all true.
one more anecdote that's G-rated we could share is the desk situation.
Oh, yes. We were in this tiny room. There was like 10 of us. If you watch Silicon Valley and you see the desk that they're sitting on with all this crap everywhere and computers on each side, that's basically what this room looked like. And there was 12 of us stuffed in there. And this one person wanted to create a stand-up desk, and those really didn't exist yet at the time, so we went and got a bunch of mail bins from the warehouse and built this monstrosity for his desk, and then he just kept leaving food out everywhere, and the food started disappearing, and he was actually like, "Where's my food keep going? Why is my food?" Or it'd be opened and spilled all over his desk. He's like, "What is going on?" Until one day he came into work and there was mouse droppings all over his keyboard, and he decided to take apart his stand-up desk that he made, and there was a literal mouse nest inside his desk, and they were pulling in the food every night that he kept leaving everywhere. So that was daily life, and it's one of those things where you'd walk in and no one would freak out. It'd just be like, yeah, that's kind of what I expect to happen here. So that is the whole backdrop. It was this amazing collective of very passionate people. At that time, probably 95% of people working at CD Baby were artists playing in the scene. It was people who were passionate about independent artists, passionate about music and playing themselves, loved the fact that we had so many unique and diverse musical voices that our catalog was one of the most unique, the most genres probably anywhere at the time. So that is the backdrop for CD Baby when the podcast was born. And when I went to Derek and asked him, I didn't know Derek that well. He was living in LA when I started working at CD Baby. So he knew who I was and I talked to him some, but it wasn't like we were best buds. So I was real nervous when I went in to ask him if I could do the podcast. Um, and I don't think he thought I would actually do it. That was my take.
In fact,
'Cause
didn't he tell you something like, "I don't wanna be on it until you've done
I
X
asked
amount of
him if I could
episodes?"
interview him for the podcast and be the first episode, and he said, "I'll be on it, but I don't want to be the first episode. I want to, I want to wait until after there's a few episodes. And then it never happened.
It never
So
happened. 300
never happened.
episodes
Never
later.
happened. And for many years, we were producing the podcast on our own time. I would edit it at home for years and years and years. I did all the editing at home. And one of the things that was interesting about podcasting at the time was that I mentioned that Chris Bolton, who helped start the podcast with us and was on it for many episodes, he really wanted to work like at a place like This American Life. In fact, he thought about doing their summer intern thing. He was really wanting to create the radio type shows like This American Life or Radio Lab. So he put a lot of effort in some of the production elements, and we would get hammered for it being too produced sounding. People were upset because it wasn't that garage
The
with,
2 drunks in the garage, right?
yes, talking for 5 hours. So a lot has changed there.
In terms of just personnel, I think the Bolt, as he finally became known as, had a bit of an identity crisis because I think when we started the podcast, he was going by Michael, right? Because I
No,
was Chris and
Charles.
Charles, that's what it was.
Charles.
So I was Chris and he was Chris. So he's like, we can't have that on a podcast. I'll be Charles. I would be Chris. And then that only lasted for, I don't know, 20 episodes. And then he became something else. And then finally he was the Bolt.
Yes. Well, what happened was he was going to go by his middle name, which I think is Robert. And so I was prepared to call him Robert, even though it was weird. It's like you telling me, "Hey, Kevin, when we hit record, start calling me Jim." I'm like, that's not your okay. So it just felt weird. And right as we hit record, he's like, "No, not Robert, Charles." I'm like, "What? Why Charles?" He's like, "I've always liked the name Charles." And so apparently
Now's
his
my
mom
chance.
apparently his mom got mad at him. Like, why on earth did you pick Charles? And then I'm like, this Charles thing has to stop. And that's when we settled on Bolton and then the Bolt.
Yeah.
And he even had a listener write a theme song for him.
Yeah. And our other coworker, Jordan, for a small amount of time, was on as sort of a co-host as well.
Yep.
And we've done lots of format changes. We had lots of interviews. Then we went through more of a roundtable, back to a mix of it
Yeah.
all in the room together. Then like this, where we're remote.
Yes. Yes. So why don't we dive in? Unless there's any other things you want to mention, we have our list of 10 things that have radically changed since the first episode of the DIY Musician podcast.
Yeah. So a lot of things have changed in the 15 years since we started the podcast. One is what podcasts even are. Huge shifts in format and presentation of podcasts. Another obvious one is music consumption habits have completely changed, and not just once, but probably 3 or 4 times since 2007. And along with that comes shifts in monetization. The way artists get paid, how they collect the royalties is completely different than it was in 2007. We've also gone through a whole bunch of shifts in the dominant social media networks, starting with basically MySpace when the podcast started. And now we have 25 competing things that have sort of all waxed and waned. Shifts in what audiences expect from artists. I think this is something we could probably have a whole episode about, but fan communities have completely different expectations for the artists that they like these days. There's been obviously a rapid acceleration in the development of tools, and that could be something like the smartphone and video creation tools, but also home recording tools. And that has changed almost everything about how artists are supposed to work these days. Another thing that's really changed is how Kevin and I have changed stylistically in our music. I guess I'll speak for myself and say I feel like a completely different artist, probably 3 times over since 2007. Our lives have completely changed. We have gone through several careers within CD Baby. Both of us had families and kids, and that is a dramatic change on its own, but then also affects how we think of our musical ambitions and what's realistic in terms of our music. How music marketing works has completely changed, and what music marketing even really is, it has completely changed in that time. And then I think the last big thing is how we think about niche has changed. And we talked earlier about the artist who made music about horses. Well, back then that was very artist to fan. And now there's this completely different way in which niche artists reach their audience, which involves social media and tech changes. But we'll talk all about that more in depth.
Yeah. It's a fascinating list. And I said at the top how if you go back to episode one and listen through, how it is just this amazing historical archive of that change over time. I did have an artist reach out to me recently saying they had done that and were just blown away and how it was fun to binge. Things strike you differently when you binge it as opposed to when you're, watching it week by week and waiting for things to unfold. But when you binge it, you can pick up on a lot of themes and that thread of change easier because it's happening so fast when you binge the podcast. And it's just crazy to me to look back at all the episodes and think about things that we had talked about and that change. And yeah, so we're going to dive into a lot of that.
Yeah, one thing, we would just go back to the first thing about what podcasts even are. I mean, we kind of described all the things they could be early on. But since those days, I feel like things have gone in two directions. One is like the shock comedy aspect of podcasting, like every comedian's got a podcast. Joe Rogan has super long form conversation interviews. Like that's like one trajectory. And I
Yeah.
think the other is that it went in a very scripted direction, like not even conversations, just a sort of glorified Netflix version of a radio news program or something, or even something shorter but very scripted. Like in 1 minute, I'm going to tell you the 5 things you need to do to grow your YouTube following, and it's like bum 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 bum, but very very non-conversational. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and I think another thing that's fascinating to think about, because while you were saying that, I was reminded that we've gone through three phases. You don't hear this anymore, but there was three phases of podcasting is dead after we had started our podcast. And really, much like the independent market, we'll get to in some of the change that happened there, that's been fascinating to watch and just see how far we've come with podcast. At that time there was a lot of the mainstream media or people that controlled the information outlets, because blogging was exploding at the time as well, that were very much wanting podcasting to go away because it was siphoning off audiences. It's kind of like when TV only had four channels or 10
Yeah.
channels, and now suddenly you have over 100 channels. All those people that used to benefit from those viewers and listeners, we're losing them to other formats. So podcast went through several phases. And I think also part of the reason why people were frustrated with the rise of podcasting was because it got its name podcast. Some people may not even know this because they haven't actually had an iPod. It was just named because Apple started curating a directory. They didn't host the files, but they were the only place that was curating a podcast directory that was easy to use. And it was an app built in to the iPod that made it easy to subscribe to those podcasts. And so just how it sort of started to break mainstream, then people say it's dead, then even further. But then I think when Serial came out, which was very scripted, it almost felt like a Netflix show, but just audio. When that really went crazy, I felt like podcasting really, really, really became a mainstay. It's not going away, and it's very valuable and useful to get a message out.
Well, and there's also what I would say is the first wave is like totally user generated
Yes.
content that is someone just sort of carving out their own little time and audience to say, I now create media. And the only thing that matters is whether people listen to me, you know? And then that maybe that second wave you're talking about seemed to be when the existing media establishment kind of co-opted it or saw the opportunity
Yes.
and said, now NPR and whatever else, all these existing media organizations, the New York Times, just spun up their own podcasting empires and sort of took their content into that format. And then I don't know, maybe I don't know what you think of as the third wave, but I see a balance now where that kind of produced scripted podcast voice of a traditional media outlet still does quite well, but I still listen to plenty of independent
Yeah, I think
DIY type podcasts.
really when, like, you're correct, those media outlets started putting stuff out, but a lot of people were still like, "What is this?" Or they weren't really embracing the podcast format. They were just basically cutting up pieces of their programming elsewhere. And then I think with Serial, which is a great podcast that was spun off by NPR. that really showed how powerful of a format it could be. A lot of people already knew what podcasts were by that point, but from then on, it became very clear that it is a medium that's here to stay and it's very powerful and useful. And it could be anything. It could be very scripted and short because, for some people, seeing that we hit 300 episodes, they might think, big deal. The podcast I listen to with Joe Schmo, who just rambles for hours every day, he's got 1,000 episodes. But then you have podcasts like Serial that in order for them to hit 300, it'll take them 30 years because they do like a short 10 episode season every year or try to. It's very different. And you can find basically whatever you want now, which I think is what the beauty of podcasting is.
Well, one thing to say before we move on, I know you said we're going to discuss some of the things that almost killed the podcast. One of the things was that this was until very recently never really in our official job
No, it wasn't.
title, and that was very much the case for the first 5 or 6 years, I would say, until you and I were more, like, fully entrenched in the marketing business side of things. So that always meant that it was a extracurricular thing for the
It
most
was.
part, and when you have bosses telling you to do anything but that, it makes it hard to justify staying up till midnight or whatever to edit a podcast that isn't your job. So I don't know if that was on your mind as one of the things that
Oh
almost
yeah,
killed it
yeah. I
fully.
mean, I was doing the podcast until like 2 years ago. I was editing it all myself. In recent times, when Chris Bolton was back involved, he and I would tag team that. But I was editing it all myself, and usually on Friday nights, Saturday nights, and that's why the podcast was very inconsistent. Also, the tools to create podcasts have come a super long way. We used to have to do it with field recorders in person. And if I interviewed somebody, they were in the same room with me. And it was a big deal when we were able to take conversations from a phone and use a phone tap to plug it into our field recorder and get those conversations. And now those things are so easy and seamless that it's super easy to podcast, where back then a lot had changed.
I don't know if it
Well,
was our 2nd or 3rd episode, but I remember all 3 of us, you, me, and Chris Bolton, all squeezing into this tiny little office at the Doug Fir Lounge in Portland to interview Alicia Rose, who was the
yes.
talent buyer for that venue. It was all about booking gigs, and the 4 of us with maybe like a Shure SM57 mic or something that got passed around. It was so cluttered, and the SM57 that we passed around by hand went into a little Zoom recorder, and I
Yep.
don't mean Zoom like we all use Zoom now. This was a little handheld audio recorder. That audio would get bounced to GarageBand, I think,
Yep.
and then the whole thing would get mastered in what, Audacity.
Yeah, we would edit in both of those because both of them had tools that were geared towards podcasting. I mean, that's one thing that's interesting that's changed. GarageBand was really a major tool for podcasters. It had all these things in there because the podcasts were mostly just in the Apple podcasting app. And so there was things to make it more interactive, like you could have on-screen cards and things like that and links. And they took all that out of GarageBand. Had all these production tools geared towards podcasting. I don't know why. That's the one thing I don't understand why they did that. But yeah, a lot has changed there. Let's move on to music consumption. That how much has changed over the years, and thinking about the interviews we've done with artists, the topics that we've focused on as far as like in getting fans engaged and how fans were consuming music. You've already said we had that unique perspective, but because at that time, CD Baby, our revenue and our jobs was just as much about selling CDs as it was helping artists distribute their music.
Yeah, so when I was in college, Napster was a thing. So I'd had some experience with like the file sharing thing. But after that I moved to Oregon and it was still pretty much for me back to a CD only world. Like I wasn't doing a ton of file sharing. And so when I started begging this guy I knew at CD Baby for a job all the time, it was because I knew it as a CD distributor and I was selling my CD there. So that felt really exciting to me, that something like akin to like Discord Records in DC, like in the 80s, that was like one of the only indie label success stories, was becoming more and more a thing through CD Baby, where artists could yeah,
Yeah.
move units directly to fans. So that's why I wanted to work at CD Baby. Once I got the job, iTunes was basically a brand new thing, and they were just internally at CD Baby trying to figure out how to deliver music in a very efficient, not entirely manual way. I don't know exactly how the revenue broke down, but when I started, I imagine most of the revenue came from CD sales.
Yeah.
Um, since then, obviously, iTunes was almost the entire digital music ecosystem back then. And that sort of started breaking apart with the introduction of YouTube and on demand streaming. Pandora was a thing too, I guess, but mostly the money was coming from iTunes. Then that shifted to streaming. And now we're in this world where social videos are a huge part of monetizing music, but also breaking artists. And things feel like they have changed. I don't even know. Many, 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 many times.
Yeah. As far as consumption, when we started the podcast, definitely album format was the format. You might find some singles on iTunes because iTunes was still new. So people were still treating the digital world like the physical world. And that's some of the things people complain about with the digital world are still holdovers of creating a digital ecosystem based on the physical world instead of just reimagining what it could be without thinking it has to be tied to some physical medium that has limitations. It was definitely people were consuming a full album and artists were still really operating by that release cycle that the traditional business set up. But yeah, I think the one thing that was interesting to see because with music consumption, there was really two tracks that we've seen over the years. It's that what the fan community wants or is going to adopt because there's been lots of things that they haven't adopted, like mini disc or DAT recordings and all these other digital formats that had been tried in the past. What the fan community, how they want to engage with music. And then on the other side, this growing independent market that wants to fully monetize themselves and what works best for that agenda. And those two things are not always aligned,
They don't
as we can
always
see
dance together, right?
as we can see with the state of affairs we find ourselves in with how streaming works and streaming payout works. It's really geared towards fan consumption, a model that's based on that compared to someone who has a product they want to sell and get compensated for.
Well, this probably bleeds into our third point about monetization shifts, as you're saying, but as the speed at which you can access exactly what you want in music accelerated, you didn't need to get a full album, like you said. So deep cuts aren't always such a great thing anymore. Like people just wanted the one song. And with iTunes, they could do that legally. They can make a purchase of one song, which radically changed the demand for albums. And artists who wanted to make albums as a statement suddenly had to confront whether that was worth it or not. Like their own sense of artistry was challenged by what the consumer or the fan was really demanding. So it went from like album to song, but with TikTok, it's gone from song to hook. So now it's like 15 seconds of a really good chorus or particular lyric that lines up with a meme or a dance or something might really be all that's being demanded in that context. So everything's gotten smaller, shorter attention spans. This is no secret to anyone, but I do
We're
feel like
getting dumber is what's happening.
we're getting faster at being dumber. Is that
Yeah, self-imposed ADHD or something where it's like, "Wait, can't look. No, what's going on?" Yeah, it's really interesting to have seen that progression.
well, and then as that changed and as the digital ways of content proliferation, but also collecting content identification and collecting royalties changed, it moved artists away from that. I don't know if it was a sort of middle class local musician heyday in the late 90s, early 2000s, where an artist could think, well, I'm going to make 1,000 CDs and I'll probably sell them all. And that'll set me up. What's $10 times 1,000 is enough to make the next record. So there was this way in which we all thought, oh, this system works. We're set to at least recoup some money to put into the next recording in a predictable way.
Yeah.
But the technology changed that.
I think what's interesting is with the shifts in monetization, the industry had so long been focused on one or two main revenue streams. I'll say 3 actually, but as it relates to the work that we did at CD Baby at the time, it was really one, is that CD sales. There was a dominant format that sold, vinyl and tapes, or then it was CDs. The other thing being radio airplay, performance royalties from radio airplay for songwriters, and then live performance. But as far as our work was concerned, the industry was really struggling with the idea of feeling like losing control, these new formats, which the next topic is rise and fall of social platforms. So this kind of plays into that. These new formats emerging that we don't have our control over yet, and its new rights are implicated. And so it really went from feeling like, oh, I can control how music is exploited, to now it's about monetizing, and that one revenue stream on CD sales being the main for recorded product. That's your mainstream. To now it being important to capture so many different revenue streams because they're all needed and you can't just focus on one. But for a long time, the tension in the industry was they didn't want to allow these other forms of monetization because they were messy, they didn't work as easy as what they had, been used to with selling CDs and other physical goods. And so yeah, that change has been interesting. There's still tons of work to do there. It's amazing to me how certain platforms like YouTube sort of set the precedent for how monetization worked on social platforms, but it's still sort of whack-a-mole getting some of these platforms to compensate for the usage of music. It's getting better, but still a ton of work to do. But collecting all these revenue streams became incredibly important, as opposed to what a lot of people initially did, is like try to stifle those and run away from them, or get their music pulled, or not allow for it. And so that has
Yeah.
been a huge shift.
Well, three things to add to this before we go to social platforms. One, you use the word usage, and I think that is one of the most useful ways of understanding the shifts over the last 20 years is we moved from an ownership music economy to a usage-based economy. You used to have to buy a thing, whether it was a CD or vinyl. Then you even had this weird transitional skeuomorphic phase of buying a download that you still kind of own because it lived on your computer or your hard drive or whatever. And now it's all just about access. You pay for access, or maybe you don't even pay for access. Maybe an advertiser is paying on your behalf to have access to something that you use. But even thinking back, it seems so radical. Maybe we take it all for granted now, but major shift. Another thing is sync licensing was really not a thing for independent artists 20 years ago. Or when we were starting the podcast, I think it was at the beginning of being a thing where an independent
Yes.
artist could get a sync placement in a TV show or something. But that's another thing that's radically changed. And the last one is publishing royalties. If you were an independent artist up until at least fairly a decade into the 21st century, you weren't going to get publishing royalties most likely because A, you weren't getting radio play, and you weren't moving enough units of a physical CD to get significant mechanical royalties. That changed as things became more usage based, and CD Baby Pro Publishing did quite a bit to get musicians access to be able to collect their publishing royalties. But also, we did a huge amount of education about what publishing even is, and sort of saying, like, hey, songwriters, you're owed this money. Let's help you get it.
Well, and to one of your points, I think one of the biggest shifts in monetization that artists have struggled is what you said, that it went from a buying economy where you were trying to get your fans to buy something, to an economy based on them actually listening to your music. You can get people coming to a show or seeing you on the street busking and have CDs. Ah, they'll buy a CD, support that artist, but they might never listen to it. My parents have an enormous amount of CDs still in wrappers at their house when they've gone to a concert or something and saw an artist, and they were on a cruise, and it's the artist that sits in the corner plays. They bought a CD. They never listened to it. That artist made $10 or $15, but they didn't get a fan. They didn't get a listener. They got $15. Artists enjoyed that paradigm, but that still didn't mean that people were listening to your music. Now, the way you monetize, it requires people to listen to your music. So, doing fancy things to just get them to buy a CD while you may make money didn't necessarily build listeners, but now you have to build people that like your music. The music has to be the sales piece to keep people coming back, because if it's not, bringing them back, you're not going to make money. And that's something I know that artists still trying to make sense with streaming and all the new monetization options under that old lens, and it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So let's move into the rise and fall of social platforms because that really plays into the monetization piece and how things changed, but also it also had a lot of other implications for artists over the years.
Yeah, so when I started at CD Baby, it was a time when for your average kind of local musician, what you would have for your web presence consisted of probably a website and then just Google searches, like people randomly finding you because they're searching for your genre or certain keywords, or maybe they're looking up shows in the area. So your presence was your website and random searches. And that all changed with the introduction of MySpace and YouTube and stuff like that. And then that grew into sort of WordPress and Tumblr blogs, then Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, real like things accelerated. But it went from a very curatorial, like I am in one place and you come find me, maybe at random, to a place where you could sort of push things out and be discoverable in a much greater sense. And that also, I think, coincided with the shift in narrative of what independent music even meant. Because when I was starting at CD Baby, I remember hearing stories of artists like Amy Mann, who had had a major label career and a big audience, and they were excited about going indie. But it's easy to be excited about that when you already had your fan discovery paid for by major labels. And I love Amy Mann. This is not to discount her, but it was a time when independence basically meant, oh, big famous artists could now reap the benefits of collecting all the money from their sales. And even if they sell a lot less because they're earning 100% of it, independence is good. That shifted towards truly like, no, I'm like an unknown artist, but I can go out and find the world, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, to piggyback on what you're saying, there was definitely like when we're starting at CD Baby, because I mentioned that we would get calls. How do I get a label deal all the time? This vibe that independence meant that you were lesser than as it relates to the music industry. Like, oh, it's too bad you're just an independent artist. Maybe someday you'll make it. And I think you can see that if listening to the podcast, going from being this squeaky wheel that at times the mainstream industry just wanted to go, for it to go away because it was a nuisance. And also, a lot of the independent artists were doing innovative things that the mainstream industry was still too scared to do, especially as it relates to the rise of social platforms. So, to me, for artists who are now entering the market, the independent segment is celebrated, and there are so many artists that make uh, huge livings, massive careers, and have chosen to maintain their independence. And you see major label artists leaving to pursue a career independently. And the independent market now makes up 40% of the market, where at the time that was not the case. It was this group of people that were sort of causing problems for the traditional system that really didn't want things to change.
As far as any of this relates to social, it seems like we recorded an episode a few months ago about like is social media dead? And we griped about all the bad habits and the bad sort of mental health stuff that social can cause, but we also have to thank it for the ability to reach anyone, to prove to ourselves or to the world that our music is valid in that way, where independence doesn't have to mean lesser than, because you can have a huge career reaching strangers out
Yeah.
there.
And that this is one of the things that was very, very critical to, I think, the growth of the independent artist community, the growth of CD Baby, and just the independent artist community becoming a creative force. And I don't just mean musically, but creative force in driving new ways of connecting with fans, because my feelings about big tech are very different these days than it was back then. Yes, nobody loved Google back then either, but it was an exciting time. It was all these things opening up. The internet was getting faster. So uploading and downloading MP3s was becoming easier. And things like MySpace, where artists were actually getting gigs based off having a good MySpace presence. And it's the first real audio player that I can remember people using for independent artists to be heard online, and you could go discover new artists basically free, and
Yeah.
have access to them. And so these platforms, it was such an exciting time at CD Baby. And if you go back and listen to the archives, a lot of our episodes were talking about how an artist was using a new platform, whether it be MySpace or YouTube or Twitter or blogging, to really drive an audience and tap into a market that didn't want top 40 music and really
Yeah.
connect directly with fans. And so it was super exciting. And
My
that was like the first wave of social media platforms, like that really everyone was super excited.
MySpace gets a lot of crap, and you and I have probably talked. It made a lot of snide jokes about MySpace, but with hindsight, I really miss it because I realize we didn't know what we had. Basically, it was great for what you're saying, that sort of B2B or whatever, like artist to artist co-booking tours and finding opportunities. But I also had tons of people just randomly find me. I don't know how. Maybe they went through that sort of web of mutual friends or whatever, and they just write me and be like, "Hey, I heard your music. I love it." Like I was making fans through no effort of my own by just having a
Absolutely.
music player on MySpace. And then it all went away.
Well, and what was so amazing about what MySpace did that I think has not been replaced is that you could, at the time, both of us were in the Portland, Oregon area. We both had music projects going, and you could go to Seattle, find similar bands, look at what venues they're playing, and message them saying, "Hey, let's do a show swap. I'll open for you in Seattle. You open for us in Portland." And that was a major tactic artists were using to get in front of audiences in other cities. And it was so easy. And led to some really great connections. I know most people are probably hearing that if they weren't a part of that thing, oh, that'd just be a bunch of garbage and spam. There was that element there, but it was actually incredibly useful in finding artists in different cities, being able to see where they're playing, see some activity stats, and know that, hey, this band would probably be a good fit for us. There really isn't an easy way to do that still.
Yeah, well, things are so scattered now. That was also a time when literally if you were on social, it meant you were on MySpace. Like
And you can do
MySpace.
stuff on Bandcamp and you could go look in bands in town, but that we're so fractured now.
Yeah.
Everybody was on MySpace then. Everybody that was an artist was that was the one place.
Well, and the one thing failed to mention when in the beginning of this section when I said everyone had a website and you could be found through Google searches, I left off an important thing, your email list. That was your one way you owned a connection with fans back then, and strangely, it still is. I mean, SMS lists, email, that's maybe one of the only ways to just maintain what you've built with your fans because MySpace proves that all platforms are gonna go away. One day, we won't rely on Instagram the way we do now. We won't rely on TikTok in 20 years or 10 years the way we do now. These things always ebb and flow, but if you have a direct communication method, I don't think
Yeah.
email or texts are gonna go anywhere.
The hard lesson artists learned for the first time with the demise of MySpace was that it's super critical that you own your fan relationship. And it's funny because we've also gone through several phases of people saying email's dead, email marketing's done, no one reads email anymore. It's still email or what you said, text messaging is still the only way you can truly own the direct connection with a fan. And otherwise,
Besides
you
NFTs and social tokens.
right. So it was a hard lesson because one day MySpace deleted everything and a lot of those followers went away, a lot of those fans disappeared. So we still at times continue to make the mistake of building up other platforms, giving them all our fans, but then not having any way to contact our fans directly. And that's a critical lesson still, because if you're thinking, oh, Instagram will never go away, it may never go away. In fact, we talking about some of the things that we said in the podcast. Like I know at one time I was like really bagging on Facebook and I'm like, Facebook's done. And this was when Instagram was really growing. Facebook hadn't bought them yet. I think maybe Snapchat was existing. I can't remember. I know Vine existed at the time. So it's like all these newer platforms were popping up. And so things may not go away, but one thing is true, what people put their attention towards definitely shifts. And those platforms have evolved to where Facebook, unless you're paying to reach your fans, you pretty much aren't going to get to them. And
Yeah.
so, incredibly important that you own your fan relationship. The other thing I wanted to add about the rise and fall of social platforms is there was this second period of time where it was super exciting because when the App Store was launched and all these cool, unique apps started coming out that were, getting tons of money and they were using music in an interesting way, but it also became the point where the tech companies put themselves in the driver's seat as far as monetization is concerned because there was sort of this too big to fail mentality for some of these platforms. They were using music illegally, they were using film illegally, photos illegally, but because it was so popular, the industry didn't know how to handle it. And I remember being at a music tech conference in San Francisco. This was probably 2010, 2011, talking to somebody that's like, "Oh yeah, I've got my app that I'm designing, creating. It does all this with music and stuff." And I said, "Well, if you gotten the rights to use that," it's like, "The rights to use it? How? Like what? Like what rights are there?" And it's like, I'm in Silicon Valley. I've got investors. The rules don't apply to me. And so the tech industry really put themselves in the driver's seat of monetization. And the idea of user generated content really was born at that time. And that really was the struggle with the social platforms as it relates to monetization and who really gets to decide how this thing works moving forward.
Well, and user generated content leads to our next thing about what audiences now expect from artists is completely different. Again, to go back to when I started at CD Baby and what I thought my obligations to my audience were at the time, I would mostly practice and write and record music with my band at a studio, in a basement, at a gig. We were very much like, we're just making music. And the time I spent towards thinking of myself as a movie star, like we all do now, would be like when I need press photos, which is like once a year. You think, oh, I'm going to get in an outfit and I'm going to be in front of a camera for 20 minutes on a Saturday once a year. And maybe we shoot a video. And so that's one other day a year. Maybe you think of yourself as the star of your own movie when you're writing a press release and putting out an album. But it was very limited. It probably accounted to 1 or 2 weekends a year where I felt like a personality. And the rest of it was just I'm a musician. I practice, I write, I play, I record. And now it's the exact opposite. It's like we're all movie stars all the time, except no one's watching our film because everyone else is a movie star. And they don't
What
have
if your
time to watch
film
your
sucks?
stupid film because they're making their stupid film. And when do they get around to doing the thing that should be most important? The writing, the recording, the practicing, the being together with their bandmates or whatever. Like it still happens, I know, but that is greatly shifted. I guess all this to lead to my question is that just what we think we're supposed to do, or is that what audiences truly want? Because when I discover an artist I love, I don't really care if they're hardly ever on Instagram. Like, if Phoebe Bridgers posts something once a year or like 20 times a day, it doesn't really matter to me all that much because I'm just going to Spotify to listen to her music.
Yeah, that'd be something I'd be interested in hearing from other artists what they think. And I think that was sort of the spirit behind the Is Social Media Dead episode, because I feel like maybe we're going through a shift right now where the expectations are changing again, where there is less expectation about being online. Definitely, like what you're saying was this weird thing. And we used to get calls at CD Baby and into the podcast, and when we'd be out speaking to artists, that the whole idea of social media, they hated it. They hated what you just described, the idea that I wanna go away and write my genius record for a year, then release it, do a tour, have a website that has the tour dates in my bio and a few photos, and that's what I want the experience to be. And now you're telling me I gotta be on camera, I gotta be good on camera and do things talk to people directly, and I don't want to
Yeah,
do that and create content. I don't want to be a content creator.
it's like, "Hello, dear genius musician. Please also be beautiful, charismatic, funny, quick, technologically proficient." What else can we throw in here? Like
Financially secure because you ain't getting money from this.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, it was a big shift. So, over the years on the podcast, I've used you 2 as an example because I feel like you 2, for better or for worse, oftentimes, I think for worse, in their career as things shifted, refused to shift with it. And they were the band I've always mentioned. It's like they'll still disappear for 3 years, 4 years, and you'll hear, oh, one of them will say, record's coming out next year. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. And the year after that, and it finally comes out. They do a worldwide tour that lasts for 2.5 years. And then the whole process starts again. And there's no YouTube content to chew on or have, in between. They're not releasing stuff. You're not seeing photos of them in the studio, nothing. And I always, as their career went on, said for them, I felt like it was a huge missed opportunity to engage with fans and without having to think about it in the old mindset. But I do see artists frustrated with the idea that now fans, if I don't keep posting stuff, do they forget about me? They've got so much stuff that they're being hit with every day. If I don't do that, will they even listen to my music anymore, or will they move on? It's very different. And again, like you said, it's not necessarily, no one ever surveyed the fan community that I've seen and said, "We expect that you post on Instagram 4 times a week, and if you're not good on video, I just won't listen to your music." But these things are tools that are really helpful at times to engage audiences, and it's finding that balance of what is truly helpful versus what's just a waste of time.
Yeah, well, this kind of bleeds into our next one about the speed of development and new tools, because all of these shifts in how we think of ourselves as content creators and whether or not our fans expect us to be content creators is enabled by or facilitated by the fact that we now have content creation tools that never existed before in our pocket. So you can make and edit and post a video in a minute that in the late 90s would have taken you a whole day or more to put
And 10
together.
grand.
And yeah, right. And so and I think like most tech shifts or any shift, there's pros and cons. Like on the one hand, there's maybe this sort of constant low grade narcissism of us all thinking we need to be movie stars. And yet at the same time, because it's so immediate, I do think there's been a healthy thing in the disparity between there being a few shining stars like the Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie type star, and then everyone else who's a nobody. Now we all get to be a little bit more real and maybe slightly more celebrity.
Yeah.
But I do think potentially that's done a good thing for what we expect of people who want to be noticed. They maybe don't have to be perfect. There's more room for authenticity now because of this.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to some of the earlier points we said about just podcasting and the rise of these tools. And we used to have these celebrities, and these are the real celebrities because they've been vetted by a certain industry to be good. And the real tension between the mainstream market and whether it be music or media in general with podcasting and the rise of independent artists was that they're spending millions and millions of dollars to maintain that appearance that these are the people that have been vetted that you should listen to and um and should consume, where then these independent artists start making records cheaper, they start building audiences directly. And there was this idea of the industry still trying to say no, but these are the real people, those people aren't the real people. And now I think that technology and tools and the way social platforms work in a good way have really leveled that playing field, that no longer does somebody look at content and I think go, well, I've never heard of this person, I don't care. It's more like, are they saying what I'm looking at, is it interesting? What they're saying, is it interesting? Does it sound good? And I think, when with the rise of like viral video and viral content in a good way, 'cause there's a lot of terrible things that social media has brought, but in a good way, it has trained people that, hey, if it's good, that's all that matters. If this person's engaging, that's all that matters. If the music is good, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter if it's not on a major label.
Well, yeah, and you're saying the sort of the celebrities were vetted by an industry that presented them in a very polished manner. And I think advertising has changed in that way where if something seems like an ad, if it seems polished, you're going to distrust it because it needs to look more immediate, more DIY, more kind of just in the moment. And that is, I think, radically shifted people's aesthetics visually, musically, like that sort of what we probably used to call as like the garage sound or the 4-track home
Mhm.
recording sound. There is now like an electronic music version of that, whether it's kind of hyper pop or within any genre. It's like the more it sounds like it was done at home in a way or on a phone or whatever, I think people kind of lean into trusting it a little more, which is interesting. And I think it takes some pressure off of artists to have to go into a studio for 2 years and $1,000,000 and make like a Steely Dan album or something, or to spend $15,000 on a music video. It's okay to have it be like a phone. So for our budgets, that's very nice.
Yeah, it's become cheaper and easier to make music and release music. And also, the fan community has been along for that ride. Like I said, there's this authenticity that's actually, in some cases, preferred. And, the development of these tools and the shift of audience expectations, I think you kind of alluded to it in what you said, but it's like in some cases, people are fans of an artist and have never even listened to their music on Spotify. They just like what they do on Instagram,
Mhm.
whether it's they do covers or what they do on YouTube. It's like they follow them for that, and they haven't ever actually gone and downloaded or listened to or streamed an official release by that artist because some of what they enjoy about them doesn't have to be that, which presents some interesting challenges with artists that a lot of artists ask us, how do I get my fans who like what I'm doing on YouTube to actually go to my website and buy something or go listen to it on Spotify? There's lots of challenges related to that.
What's like Gil, who we interviewed a few episodes ago about TikTok, is in that exact situation. Like he probably has many, many viewers who love him for his mini art, and he knows himself like 1% of those people will ever go to Spotify to listen to my music, but he still does it because it's part of his calling card, part of his creative output.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think because we're talking about speed of development and new tools, one thing that has helped the independent artist community is so many, especially like in the hip hop world, like beat creators and people that produce music for other artists like that have made amazing sounding things just in their bedroom. And that idea and concept has become considered cool and acceptable. Where, like I was saying in years past, that was sort of like, oh, this music isn't as good. They didn't go to a fancy studio. Oh, they recorded it on a 4-track, or there was definitely the idea of indie music was considered, oh, it's probably not going to sound as good. And there
Yeah.
was a time where indie kind of did have that connotation to it, that you're going to hear something that's lower fidelity because it probably didn't have the massive budget and ability to record well.
Well, and the biggest place I noticed that is actually album cover design. Like, I feel like just trashy, clashing, intentionally bad aesthetics is the cool aesthetic of like the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. But that's kind of nice because if we're also supposed to be designers, don't expect me to be a designer. It's much easier to just say, hey, I'm going to make something that looks like crap on purpose.
That's one of the things I miss about the CD Baby Warehouse. We still have the CD Baby Warehouse. We still warehouse CDs and ship them. Most of those sales are through Amazon.com these days, but it's now in a different location than our offices. Well, I'm at home, so I mean, it's not connected to my house, but I used to go out there and just walk around and look at the album art because there was some of the craziest stuff. We actually, even in one time in our break room, had started a wall of like the craziest artwork we could find. It was one of those things people had mixed feelings about. I was one of them because it was hilarious and amazing. But sometimes artists would stop by and visit, and a few of them thought we were making fun of people, which in some cases I think that was the intent. But a lot of it was just almost like, this is just so wacky or mind-blowing or outside the mainstream that it's fascinating, and
It
it
was
was
quite a
interesting to
slice
look.
of humanity.
Yes.
That's what it was.
A lot of, "Wow, I would never would have thought to do that and then put that on my album art."
Not only would I have never thought of that, if I had, I never would have
I would've
done it, and if I'd done it, I never would have put it on my album cover. There's a
Yes.
lot of steps in there.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, but, independent music, free market, do what you want, see if it works, because sometimes it would work and we'd be blown away by it. That's partly why that wall was so fascinating, because it wasn't like everything up there was something that would never sell. Sometimes it was things that did sell and you're just like, "Wow," you know, there's something for everyone,
There's
and
an
whoever
audience
this
out there.
audience is, I'm not a part of it, but but kudos to them. So, the 7th one we had was how our music has changed, and I thought that was interesting when you put that on this list. I thought, that's an interesting thing to discuss." You can go first.
Let's see. I think around the time the podcast was starting, I feel like it was kind of at the peak of my critical success or whatever, in a way of like having a lot of access to studios and players. And I've gone in a way more sort of solo singer songwriter route since then for a lot of reasons, but just self sufficiency became just more manageable. So I think my music has become more understated, more personal, just not as flashy. Like I back then I'd put like horns and strings and electronic stuff, and like it was just very dense. And I've become more okay with things breathing since
Yeah,
then.
yeah.
How about you?
Well, I was gonna mention, kind of plays into some of the tools. During our major label days, when I was like, "I think I might be done with this," I was completely burnt out. I was from the West Coast and found myself living in Nashville and Atlanta. I love Nashville, but it was kinda one of those things where I went to college, and then at the end of it, this music thing happened and away we went. I was suddenly super busy living in a foreign land of Atlanta, and didn't know anybody there and just really burnt out. Of course, because we are on a major label, we were the last to get paid and everyone was getting paid and we were generating a lot of money, but just not for ourselves. And I said, "You know what? I want to move back to the West Coast." And I was talking to one of the guys. I'm like, "But it's easy. I can fly in anytime when we want to do shows. And when we want to record, I can fly in. That's not a problem." Uh it wasn't as easy as I was making it out to sound back then, but that reality has actually materialized where I live on the West Coast. I fly in pretty regularly to record or play shows or do what we need to do. And the online collaboration tools has really changed our songwriting process, where it used to be we had to all be in a room together and hammer out ideas. And now we create folders in Dropbox. We all upload ideas, then hammer on each other's ideas. Sometimes we just still do it in person. I was just there for a week doing that, but the whole way we make music is changed, and it's just interesting to see how that has happened and evolved, how what we do and how we make music because of that.
Yeah, I think another thing I just thought of for me is that I used to have the time, and I mean, I probably didn't have the money. I was probably putting it on credit cards and then paying it off. But I found a way back then to dig into a project. So it'd be like, I'm going to go into the studio for 2 weeks and I'll have something done. That didn't always mean I'd put it out on time or anything like that. But I tended to go into a real focused phase of creation. And I think that's changed probably for a lot of reasons. Maybe because I live very far away from people I still like to collaborate with. So that's slower and more piecemeal. I'm a lot busier. I have a family. So it feels much more scattered, I guess, now. And so things kind of come together, they accrue into a project a lot slower. I don't necessarily think it suffers because of that. I have to be more patient now, I
Yeah.
guess I'll say.
Well, and that leads to the next one, how our lives changed in terms of musical ambition. I think the one thing that I know the artist community has struggled with, and it may not be as big of an issue now, it certainly was way back in the day when artists were still so desperately trying to get on a label. And I feel like the whole a lot of the I need to get on a label drive was not just based in because that's how I'll have success, but it was also because that will validate me as a real artist. And my family and friends will see that this is a valid use of my time and this valid pursuit. And so, as far as it relates to how our lives have changed in musical ambition, for me, that validation is more about I'm just so excited that I still get to make music with guys that I have strong creative bonds with. It's something I've been with other bands over the years that have done good things, but it's like in this particular instance, I've been around enough to know that what we have together musically is very unique. And as far as the trust and how we work together. And for me, it's just I'm excited that I get to just create and still make music that I think is commercially viable and not using that as a measurement of success anymore. Because for me, the fact that we get to make music and put it out to the world is awesome. And I want to keep doing that. And so, as far as my musical ambitions, yes, we still pursue everything at what I would consider a professional level. We don't just throw junk out there, but the goal isn't to sustain our livelihoods anymore, which is how it started for me at the beginning of Small Town Poets. But the goal is just we want to put out music that we think is good. We want to still impact people's lives. We get emails all the time about how songs impact people. And to me, that's the motivation that keeps me going now. And of course, I want to make all the money possible from our musical assets that are out there. I want to build as many fans as possible, but it's also just going, what do I really want? And for me, I want to keep creating. I want to keep making music that I feel is good and has an impact on people.
Yeah, probably a lot of listeners might relate to this, but I think as my years have progressed, I've had like a sort of throttling down of what the expectation is. And like, when I was 18, it's like, oh, I'm going to be in a band that sells out stadiums, like U2 level. And then it's like, maybe it'll be more like Radiohead. And then a few more years go on. I'm like, I think I'd be happy if I was like Wilco and sold out theaters. And then, and then you go and a few years later, I think I'd be happy if I just sold out like a 300 cap room in every city we tour. And then I'm like, I think I'm lucky if I sell out a 300 cap room in my own damn hometown. Then I stepped away from pursuing music with the same intensity while I had my daughter. And now I think I'm in this place where I'm like, my favorite shows are literally in front of, 20 people in a bookstore or something where it's like, as long as there's an attentive audience and I can play my own music and occasionally go back to Oregon and record music that I like with friends, it's enough. And then the other thing is my ambitions got lower in that regard. I think also just like having a family, it's like a little dose of reality of what's actually important. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's
Well,
once my daughter was born, I'm like, oh, I only wanted all that stuff because of some sort of insecurity. I mean, sure, it'd be nice to play a concert in front of 100,000 people or whatever, but the like desperate need to have that is really more about some insecurity rather than the experience itself.
yes. Yes. Well, I feel like if I look at my music career, it started out where I feel like I was really trying to prove myself to others.
Yeah.
And then it went through this phase where I felt like I was trying to prove myself to myself. That you have talent, you do have abilities, or even really just finding what I'm good at and being okay with that. As much as I love Slash and talk about Guns N' Roses, even though that's not the main style of music I listen to, I'll never be Slash and being okay with that. That's not where my strengths are and kind of finding my strengths and being okay with it. And then now just being like, I'm just excited that I get to do this and prioritizing its importance and not letting it die is important because this is a gift that being able to do this any moment we get to do it is a gift and I'm going to cherish it for that.
Well, the weird inconsistency in us saying that our ambitions had something to do with either proving something to the world or insecurity is we were at least enough ourselves to try to do that through music. Because if we really wanted to prove something to the world, we do it in a way that they value, and we'd be, like, in finance or something, like
Bankers or
yeah, like, we wouldn't have been musicians. D No one gives a
yeah.
shit about music deep down, like I mean, they like to listen to it and they're moved by it, but they don't actually respect the lives of being an artist, I don't think. Maybe I'm
No.
wrong.
Well, the average person doesn't understand artists in culture in general and what it's like to create something and have a product that's not just a widget sitting there, but it's a piece of your soul. And that's a very scary thing. Well, we got two more and let's hit them quickly. How marketing has changed. And I think, we've kind of tapped into some of this with the talk about social platforms, but I think there's more to be said about how marketing has changed. And even just an article I was reading yesterday in a music blog that was very detailed about what artist managers are looking at as being important for their marketing. So much has changed. I mean, even when we started this podcast, your average major label did not have a digital marketing department. The idea of engaging on social media, the value of that was considered dubious and unmeasured and maybe even unmeasurable at the time. And now that is such a shift of the focus of direct to consumer, direct marketing compared to, hey, we got to have the end cap at this store. We got to have the billboard on Sunset Boulevard. We have to have the
Yeah,
music video.
and to the degree that you were paying, like, a professional to help, it would be radio promo campaigns and PR, and both of those things, at least for independent music, are well, with radio, I'd say it's a complete waste of money. PR is a crapshoot whether it's worth it or not, but, like, going straight to your audience through social ads is, I think, way better and a way more better for our authenticity and artistry than having to be a billboard or having to be on the cover of Rolling Stone or something.
Yeah, I think marketing went from being something that there are finite resources. And so therefore it was a premium, meaning there's only so many billboards, there's only so many end caps, there's only so many slots on a radio station. And therefore there's gatekeepers deciding who's worth promoting, and it was more general audiences. And that's what has been so amazing to watch at CD Baby. And one of the things that I discovered in my early days is just like how much music is out there and how many people will consume it if they know it's there. And my frustration coming from a label and wanting to be a cheerleader for independent artists was like, forget what those gatekeepers say. I saw how it wreaked havoc in some things with our career. And like, for instance, radio being a key piece. So there's a lot of politics involved, there's a lot of money involved. And to finally, get a song pitched and in the hands of the program director, if they don't like it or they just play it a little bit, that song is deemed a failure based on the gatekeeper not adding it into heavy rotation, not for the fact that fans don't like it. And so the idea that these people got to decide whether or not fans even had the opportunity to hear something and got to decide if something was a failure just based on information that was not related to the fans themselves was really frustrating for me. And I think that's one thing that marketing, you can go target your exact audience type and let them decide for themselves. And to me,
Yeah.
that's a beautiful thing.
Well, and the sort of gatekeepers and connections can still be important, but like you're saying, it sort of inverts it. Instead of you impressing those people so you can build the audience, you can build the audience in order to reach the tastemaker who then sort of adds fuel to the fire.
Yeah, and I think one of the main things that has changed, and it's I've changed my tune on labels. I used to say absolutely never, never, never sign a label deal. Really, what I was saying is, unless you actually read the contract and understand exactly the trade-offs you're getting, or understand exactly what you're getting yourself into, and understand that at some point this is going to end, and you better have a way to keep those fans with you after the label's gone. And so, with artists being able to market more directly and build audiences, the relationship between the artist and label has changed a lot. They don't go out and find unknown people and try and spend a lot of money making them stars anymore. They go look for people that are already had audiences. And I think if you're smart and you understand what you're getting yourself into and the trade offs with the label can be a step to help you reach a bigger audience, but you got to know what you're getting yourself into, and that it's not like, oh, I'm putting them in the driver's seat and my career's made. And understanding the leverage you have now that you've built an audience. And so that's one thing that has really changed from marketing and impacted, had a positive impact for artists, especially because otherwise they were just signing these out of the box, sign here so we can screw you over record deals.
Yeah, right. I think the last thing on our list is how has niche changed? So when I put this down, I was thinking about Marianne Kennedy, who wrote all of the horse themed albums, and then I forget the guy who did all the sailboat music, but they were doing almost entirely music content in the form of albums about a particular topic. They'd reach their audience, the audience would buy the CDs. And I think there is just as much a place, or maybe more of a place than ever, for niche. But to me, it looks different. It might involve,
Yeah.
instead of a whole album about horses, it might be that you have a TikTok presence where you do, I don't know, horse training tutorials or something. It's like the music overlaps with something that has to be either inspirational or instructional, educational, or funny in a short form social way. I know there's a lot of like video game music, niche stuff that overlaps with video game like instruction, like what do they call it on YouTube when they just play a game. I think to me it's moved away from being a purely artistic niche and into more of a educational content niche.
Yeah, and there's also like Marianne Kennedy. We sold so many of those albums. And she was running the interesting thing about her is she was running infomercials late at night, and that's what was driving a lot of her audience. They were calling us up, buying the CD because she would put our phone number on those ads. But at the end of the day, you still got a CD with a produced album of music that sounded like, a produced album of music. She just happens to be singing about horses and that whole lifestyle around it. Where I think some of the niche has also changed into when you look at like what happens with artists that do a lot of cover songs. Oftentimes, it's their musical virtuosity that is the niche hook, and they appeal to an audience around that, and they're doing a lot of different types of music around that hook, or there's a visual hook that they've created on YouTube that is kind of a thing as well that drives what the audience is and who is drawn to it. Like you mentioned video games or people that do music that leans more techie, or things where this person's just funny on video, and it's a part of their musical shtick online, has really changed some of the opportunities there.
Well, yeah, and then I also think I don't know what Marianne Kennedy or artists like her were doing back in the day when we started the podcast in terms of getting that audience to talk to each other. My sense is probably not nearly as much as artists do that today, but I think another thing about niche is that it's as much about making a community that talks to each other now, and that could be in the comments on YouTube, but or it could be like on Discord or Twitter where they're literally talking to one another partially about your music or your art or your videos or whatever, but also partially about the topic that you all share in common.
Yeah, I think a perfect example of that was Simon Tam in the episode we had with him, and he's spoken at our conference a few times. But in that interview, he was talking about because they had this case that went to the Supreme Court about being able to trademark their name. His band's called The Slants. So suddenly they built this niche audience of lawyers and were playing like these lawyer conventions. And their core fan was like this anime, usually someone that was in anime into anime because they were playing all these anime conventions. And he was talking about how really weird it was to be sort of having these two very divergent niche audiences that were interested in their music more because of a shared story or a shared commonality. And that's something that I think still exists and is interesting for artists to think about and go after and tap into.
Yeah. Well, we didn't talk for 300 minutes, but
Yeah, well, it's a
almost.
longer than normal episode, but hey, we made 300 of these. we can
We can
we can
sprawl.
chat. We can sprawl a little bit. And Chris, I just want to thank you for being the lovable curmudgeon on the podcast and continuing this journey with me. I don't know if we'll make it to episode 400, but I
Because
still
the
enjoy.
world won't still be here or what?
Who knows? Who knows? But I still enjoy making these episodes just as much as I did when we were first beginning. and
Oh, well,
and
thanks for
it's
keeping it going through the many times it could have died.
and I'm
It's
so
fun.
appreciative of Chris Bolton and Jordan and all the people back in the early days that added some excitement for this, and all the folks at CD Baby that are still doing what they do that makes working at CD Baby fun and exciting. It's not the crazy youth group environment it was when we started, thankfully, because we probably would have lasted this long.
Yeah.
But there's still many, many artists that work at CD Baby and people behind the scenes that are very passionate about helping independent artists that are still excited that we keep this thing going as well. And we spun it off into a conference, and we've got the DIY musician blog. And so it's something that has really been a big piece of our legacy here at CD Baby. And
Yeah.
um, I'm very
We
proud of
should
what we've accomplished.
Me too. We should also thank the listeners, and particularly listeners who have called in over the years and either asked a question or told stories. I'll give a special award to most memorable story to the guy who
I know
did
what you're going to say.
in the very first moment of his gig, wanted to do an impressive rock leap. So he thought he'd do some kind of jump and hit his legs on the wall and bounce off. But instead, he went through the drywall and got stuck in the wall in the first 5 seconds of his gig.
And
Shout out to that guy.
they even had a picture to prove it. It wasn't a wall that held up the load bearing wall. It was just like so his foot went through to the wall that to the hallway with the bathrooms were or something. It was so funny. Yeah. Yeah, we very much appreciate everybody who's been listening and along for the ride, and especially those of you that have contributed. And hey, why don't we give out the phone number? We're not going to have listener calls today because we knew this would go longer as, you know, Chris and I had to do a little reminiscing and just bring everybody up to speed on what we've seen over the years. But if you want to call our listener line and share your story or ask a question, because we started this with the episode one was we make mistakes, and we started with mistake stories just to talk about, we're doing this podcast, but part of it is it's therapy for us as well to keep learning from other artists.
Wait,
And
was that our first episode?
yeah,
Oh, that what a great way to start it. Just to
yes,
pat ourselves on the back again. Okay.
yeah. uh, it wasn't the first one we recorded. Dan Zanes was actually the first interview we recorded, because remember that napkin, we wrote down 10 episodes and we recorded 4 before we released anything, because we wanted to make sure we had episodes to keep it rolling. We were serious. We weren't going to pod fade. So if you've got a story to share or something you want us to talk about or a question, you can call our listener line at 360-524-2209 or email us at podcast@cdbabypodcast.com. So thankful for all of you that have been listening. And don't forget, right now, to celebrate the 300th episode, you can get 50% off your next single song release. Use podcast 300 at cdbaby.com. That's good until the end of May 2022. So take advantage of that.
And if you want to hear the PG-13 through X-rated history of CD Baby, tell one of the major publishers in New York City that they should reach out to us. We'll talk to our agent. We'll start writing it.
Yes. It really could have been a reality show. Easy. They would have so much stuff. It would have been
Yeah,
amazing.
that
Would have been
would
amazing.
like The Office.
Yes, it would. But funnier and crazier. Like Michael Scott seems tame compared to some of the things that happened at CD Baby. um, but speaking of that coupon code, not only is that an amazing discount, but if you use that, that'll help us continue to show that hey, people actually listen to this podcast and they go use CD Baby because of it, which keeps the bosses happy, so we can keep making this show. So, I encourage you in that. We'll be back next week with another episode. I'm looking forward to the one next week. I think it's going to be a really, really good one.
All right.
All right.
300 in the can.
300 in the can. Thank you all, and we'll catch you next time.
See ya.